Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday morning Bible study of the book of 1 Corinthians. We're going to continue our discussion today, and we're going to pick up in chapter 7 where we left off last week, there in about verse 17. To recap last week's lesson, Paul was describing the situation there in Corinth to the Corinthians regarding marriage, and he talked about various aspects of marriage and what God expects from marriage for His people. And the bottom line that we came to here is that God takes marriage very seriously. God takes marriage from the standpoint of not just about a casual, off and on again relationship, but something that's permanent. In fact, you might even equate that to a relationship of Christ and the church. It's a permanent type situation. At least that's how God views that covenant bond between a husband and a wife. And we see here that Paul gives them some practical instruction. And he encourages those that are not married to remain like him. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, Paul's idea is that when people become married, there's another person, there's a covenant relationship with that person, and it requires time. Paul was freed from that, and he could devote much of his time to serving God. You know, Paul wants the Corinthians there to be able to serve God, whether they're married or they're unmarried. And his encouragement for them is to remain Christ-like in their relationships. He gives instruction to the married Christians, those that are in a covenant relationship that are both Christians. And he gives them some instructions, and he tells them what their expectation is that God's expectation is for their relationship. And he also talks about a situation where a Christian and a non-Christian are married. You know, you can see the paradigm set up there for the people there at Corinth. You could easily see that someone may be converted to Christianity and they have a spouse that's non-believing. And for whatever reason, the non-believing spouse says, you know, this just isn't working for me anymore. I'm not there. And they want to leave. And Paul says, for you as a Christian, do everything that you can, but if they want to leave, let them leave. And they're no longer bound to them. Well, and as we see here is that there's a special relationship that occurs for those people that are in that covenant, in that marriage relationship, in that bond of unity between the Christian, non-Christian. And it has to do with sanctification, justification. In terms not of salvation, but in terms of God recognizes those unions and those children, and those things are acceptable in His sight. Well, let's move on down and pick up in verse 17 of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And let's see where Paul takes the rest of his message here in chapter 7. Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, in this manner let him walk. And so I direct in all the churches. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. Has anyone been called in circumcision? He is not to be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing. But what matters is keeping the commandments of God. Each man must remain in the condition in which he was called. Paul's message here of service, it's one of getting folks to focus upon their relationship to Christ and their ability to serve. He gives some examples in here, and he says, remain as you were called. If you were circumcised, presumably have a Jewish background, there is a physical situation there that occurs that the Jews did. They had a physical procedure that they had. Gentiles did not have that procedure. Well, now you have these two groups of people that have come together in the church. And Paul says, don't get hung up on these differences. Don't become bogged down and weighed down in your lives, in your service to Christ by virtue of your physical condition. Paul says, remain where you were called. Remember, the context of this writing, the Corinthians had a lot of divisions. They had a lot of factions. They had these differences and divides. Some they were dividing up amongst who was the best preacher, who was the best whatever. And so here he says, just remain as you're called. Let's not get hung up on the physical aspect of this, but let's do what? In verse 19, he says, circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing. These things are just physical attributes, and they don't mean anything in terms of the context of serving Christ. Well, what does? But he says, what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Each man must remain in the condition in which he was called. Now, on a side note here, called. Called where? Are we called to change our position? And he's going to talk a little bit more about that. And as we move into these next set of verses, he's going to talk more about that. But remember, the calling. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16, Paul talks about the gospel. And the gospel is the call of Christ. The gospel message, it has the power to do what? To save. Let's turn over to Romans chapter 1, verse 16 there for just a moment. Verses 16 and 17, actually. In Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, here's what Paul wrote about the gospel message. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew and to the Greek. Is anyone left out here? Well, no, to the Jew and to the Gentile, to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. Is it about the physical, brethren? Is it about the physical attributes that we have, whether we have a certain circumcision or we not have circumcised? Well, no. It's from faith to faith, assurance and conviction. Brethren, we are called for this message of Christ in order for salvation. God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous man shall live by faith. Brethren, our call here is by faith. Our service is by faith. We can't earn it. We can't do our way into it, and Paul wants to reiterate this message. Let's go back over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says, each man remain in the condition in which he was called, each person. Let's think about this from the physical condition, because he's going to give some examples here in just a moment. But think about this in the terms of being able to serve and effectively serve. In verse 21, were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you are able also to become free, rather do that. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freedman. Likewise, he who was called while free is Christ's slave. Now that's an interesting thought here, isn't it? If you're a slave when you're called, well, remain a slave. But if you have the opportunity, then go ahead and don't be a slave. But he says here is in verse 22, for he who was called in the Lord is a slave, is the Lord's freedman. Well, wait a minute. You're freed. Freed from what? Freed from sins. Freed from the guilt of sin. You're freed to serve. You know, we live in a world where we are just weighed down with guilt. We are made to feel guilty. We have this, we have that. The world operates on guilt. They motivate people to give money based upon guilt. They motivate people to do things based upon guilt. It's a power to control. Well, here, Paul says that you are freed. For us that have been called through the gospel, accepted Jesus Christ as our Savior, been baptized into the blood of His forgiveness, this idea here is that we are freed to serve. We're freed to be able to have our relationship and to be of service to God. Well, then he says something else here too. Likewise, he who is called while free, meaning I'm not a slave, is Christ's slave. So at the same time that I am a freed man, I'm also a slave. Well, that's an interesting perspective. Is that possible? Well, physical? Remember, let's not focus on the physical. Let's focus on the spiritual. At the same time that we are freed from our sins, what have we become? A slave of Christ. Remember, a slave is someone who lives under subjection. For you and I, the subjection we have obtained, or that we are under, is obtained through Jesus Christ. And here Paul wants them to realize that at the same time you're a freed man, you are also enslaved to Christ. You've been freed from the bondage of sin and the guilt and everything else that it drags you down with, but you've also turned your life over to the will of Christ in order to serve. In verse 23, he reminds them, or he tells them, you were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let's not let ourselves be enslaved to certain things. Here, he sets it up as a choice. These men and women, the people there in Corinth, and us today, have choices. We have choices how we live our lives and how we perform and what we do and where we have our faith. And here he says, do not become slaves of free men. Do not allow yourselves to be enslaved by the trappings of the world. And then he says in verse 24, brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. This idea is that God is calling us out of the guilt and sin of the world. Well, let's continue on. Verse 25. Now concerning virgins, I have no commandment of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. I think then that this is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned, and if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. But this I say, brethren, the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as though they do not weep, and those who rejoice as though they do not rejoice, and those who buy as though they do not possess, and those who use the world as though they did not make full use of it. For the form of this world is passing away. Brethren, Paul makes a lot of statements in there. He talks about your relationships. He talks about your condition. He talks about your situation. What's his focus? What's he looking at? He boils all that whole passage down in verse 31. And he says, and those who use this world as though they do not make full use of it, the form of this world is passing away. Brethren, Paul says ought to be an urgency amongst Christians to serve. What happens to us in our daily lives? Well, oftentimes we have a situation where we get caught up in the physical things of our lives. Well, I don't have a spouse, or I have a spouse and I blah, blah, blah. I don't like this one, or I don't like that, or I like this, or I like that, or I want a different job, or I want this, or I want that. And you're caught up in everything that's around you. And Paul says, put all that stuff aside. Don't be focused on those kind of things. Because why? There's an urgency to serve Christ. There probably would be little doubt that Paul would have an urgency to serve Christ because he understands that there is limited time. There's limited time available for all of us. And we may not live long enough, obviously, to see the return of Christ to this world. And we may live a number of years yet, but we may live only a few more days, hours, weeks, months. We don't know. And Paul says, make the most of all this time Don't be caught up in all these things and not be worrying about your condition and your situation. But he says, make the most of this and serve. Well, in verse 32, he continues and he says, but I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of this world, how he may please his wife. And his interests are divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of this world, how she may please her husband. This I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. He says all those things about the various conditions. It's a continuation of those verses in verse 25 through 31. He continues that thought and he says, you know what? Down here at the end, I want you to serve. He says that I have what is appropriate and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Paul's goal for those people there in Corinth, and it's the same goal for us today, is to have undistracted devotion to the Lord. As we've been discussing, we get distracted with all kinds of things. We get distracted with the things around us, what we have, what we don't have, what other people are doing, and the various things like that. And here he says it can happen even in your physical relationships that you have. But his bottom line message to these Corinthians is in verse 32, the form of this world is passing away, time is short, and then in verse 35, undistracted devotion to the Lord. Paul wants to put all these things aside in his own life. He wants to put those things aside that distract him. And he lists some examples in there about spouses and things like that. And so his idea here is that I want to be undistracted in my devotion to the Lord. Well, brethren, that's not to say that you and I that are married can't have undistracted devotion. It's not to say that we can't be devoted and we can't serve, but brethren, we better have some urgency about us. We better have some urgency in the sense that time is short. Whatever that time is, it's short and it's passing away. And here Paul in verse 35 said to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. Well, in verse 36, Paul continues this message and he says, but if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughters, if she is past her youth, and it must be so, let him do what he wishes. Let him do what he wishes. He does not sin. Let her marry. But if he stands firm in his heart, being under constraint under this authority over his own will, and has decided this in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. So then, both he who gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. A wife is bound as long as her husband lives, but if her husband is dead, she is freed to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. But in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I also have the Spirit of God. You know, brethren, we in our society, we are conditioned to do certain things. I can think of many instances when I was a little child that maybe my mother and one of her friends would be talking about, well, maybe our children can grow up and get married together. Brethren, in our lives, we focus on a lot of things. But what Paul wants these folks to understand here is, don't let all this stuff get just to distract you. You know, he goes into a discussion here about a virgin daughter and those kind of things. But the bottom line is down here at the end of this. He says, in my opinion, she is happier if she remains as is. Well, why is that? because Paul wants to focus on undistracted devotion to the Lord. And I think of us as we know it, as we who are married, we know that there is a certain commitment that we have to make to our spouses. And we have a certain obligation and a responsibility, and it's joyful. But Paul says here that it's about undistracted devotion. He's not against marriage. He's not against people that are married. None of those kind of things. But what he says here is that whatever it takes, he wants to be serious about it. He's going to be serious about his service to God. For us today, where do we stand? Are we one of those that are serious about our service to God? Or do we come in it comes in second or third or fourth place? Well, we have our things around us. We have our hobbies, our jobs, our spouses, our this, our that. And Paul says, you'd better recognize here, Corinthians, that the time is short and you need to be dedicated to service. Remember, the Corinthians were in a society that valued sexual immorality. They had it all around them. It was everywhere. It just permeated the entire existence. And there was a lot of pagans. There were a lot of people that had these false ideas about gods. It was everywhere, and there was a lot of distractions. Does this sound familiar? Do we not live in a society that is full of distractions? Oh, you and I don't see much in terms of the way of pagan idols out here on the corner, but we do have idols, don't we? We do have things that get between you and God. Paul is going to describe this. He's going to move on here in chapter 8, and he's going to start talking about some of those things. But what he says here in chapter 7 is so vital and it's so important for us, is to have undistracted devotion to God. Now his message here is not one that, and he emphasizes, don't go out here and divorce people and do these other things. No, you remain as you are. But I want you to be serious about your service to God and not just take it casually or flippantly or put it in second or third place as it may be. Brethren, next week we will pick up with chapter 8, and Paul will continue his discussion to the Corinthians about these issues that people were facing there in Corinth. Thank you, and have a great day.